I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the country that I'm located on today, the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respect to their elders, past and present. Hi, my name's Torika. I'm the founder of the Community Reading Room, and over the next couple of months I'm going to be hosting some conversations for the MPavilion MTalks summer program. The first talk in the series is called Art, Spaces and Island Ecologies, and it brings together two artists that I have great respect for, who have really paved the way for their local artist communities in Barbados and in Auckland, Aotearoa. And I'd like to introduce those speakers to you now. Emma Tavola is an independent curator based in South Auckland, New Zealand, Aotearoa. Having established her practice whilst managing Fresh Gallery Altera, a local government-funded community art gallery, Tavola's curatorial concerns are grounded in the opportunities of contemporary art to engage grassroots audiences, shift representational politics, and archive the Pacific diaspora experience. Tavola has worked in galleries and museums throughout New Zealand and is committed to curating as a mechanism for social inclusion, centralising Pacific ways of seeing, and exhibition making as a mode of decolonisation. As an active member of the South Auckland and Pacific arts community, Tavola has been engaged to produce events, conduct research and facilitate community engagement initiatives that centralise Pacific art communities and dialogue approaches. Recent national projects include Kaitani 2017 for the Physics Room at Christchurch, Dravuni Siviayani Navunilangi Beyond the Horizon 2016 for the New Zealand Maritime Museum, and Between Wind and Water 2015 for Enjoy Public Art Gallery Wellington. Tavola has discussed and advocated for a Pacific people-centred approach to curating Pacific art at institutions and symposia in Australia, Canada, the US and Fiji. In 2012, she was the first curator awarded the Creative New Zealand Arts Pacifica Award for Contemporary Art, and wrote a manifesto on Pacific curatorial practice as artist in residence with Macmillan Brown Centre for Pacific Studies at the University of Canterbury in 2017. In 2018, Tavola was appointed to the curatorial committee for the 4th International Biennial of Casablanca under Artistic Director Christine Aini. Annalee Davis is a visual artist, cultural activist, educator and writer. She works at the intersection of biography and history, focusing on post-plantation economies by engaging with a particular landscape in Barbados. Her studio, located on a working dairy farm, operated historically as a 17th century sugarcane plantation, offering a critical context for her practice by engaging with the residue of the plantation. In 2019, her bilingual book on being committed to a small place was published by Torika in Costa Rica alongside her solo exhibition, Heartseed. In 2020, she exhibited in Dhaka Art Summit, Bangladesh, had her first UK solo exhibition, Rewilding, at Harlem Art Space, and is currently showing in Florilegium, a gathering of flowers at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Edinburgh. In 2021, she will be in the group exhibition, And If I Devoted My Life to One of Its Feathers, at the Kunsthalle in Austria, and participate in the 5th edition of the International Biennial of Casablanca in Morocco. In 2011, Annalee founded Fresh Milk, an art platform and micro-residency program. She is the co-founder and co-director of Caribbean Linked, an annual residency in Aruba, cohering cultural workers from the Caribbean, and Tilting Access, an independent visual arts platform bridging the Caribbean through annual encounters. From 2016 to 2018, she was Caribbean Arts Manager with the British Council, developing programming in Cuba, Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, and part-time tutor at Barbados Community College from 2005 to 2018. She received a BFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art in 1986 and an MFA from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, in 1989. Thank you, Annalee and Emma, for joining me today for this conversation. It feels like a real dream conversation to be having you both in this space. I've had the privilege of working with both of you on separate projects and in separate parts of the world over a number of years. And I feel like there's so many synergies in the work that you both do in the communities that you belong to. And I think what I'm really hoping to get out of this conversation is this kind of nexus of working. Both of your work have hybrid practices. Oh, hello, Kat. and I think it comes from a really a place and a process that is quite decolonial, and that's very much rooted in your sense of belonging to the places that you are in and that you have that you come from, and a real I guess commitment to start difficult conversations and sort of challenge people to think about their sense of belonging and their sense of identity. And I guess I'd like to start this conversation with you both by kind of reflecting on the places that you currently inhabit and your connection to that place. And I think that kind of leads naturally into the work that you do, the communities that you belong to, and the projects and the spaces that you've set up to kind of to give back to the communities, but also to connect them to broader conversations internationally. So maybe, Annalee, maybe you could start by talking a bit about, I guess, your work as an artist, but also your background and, you know, your sense of self and identity in Barbados and the context that you work in.
Yes, thank you so much, Torika, and it's so great to share this space across the globe, literally, with the both of you today. So I'm physically located in Barbados on a very small island, 21 by 14 miles. My site is that of a former sugar plantation that was established in 1667. It's been in our family for 100 years and was converted into dairy farming 40 years ago. My practice very much deals with the residue of the plantation and the plantation as an economic model that has shaped Barbados and the wider Caribbean. So my work, both as a visual artist and as a cultural activist, is really engaging with this site. I'm inspired by a scientific concept called phytoremediation, which speaks to the capacity that some plants have to absorb toxins through their root structure. And my work as an activist in the formation of fresh milk is seeing that entity as a cultural plant intervened into this site as a way to, through its programming, its platform for critical thinking. We have a library. We bring people together, is a way to kind of, you know, respond to the trauma of this particular site by creating an inclusive platform. So it's very much a practice that understands the historical context and tries to bring a different perspective to that through my own work. And yeah, I've been here for about 20 years in this particular location, which is actually, I'm in a room now that's about 350 years old and apparently was a storage space for grain that got converted into, well, it's been through many iterations. A bookkeeper's house. I had a studio here many years ago, and it's been my home for the last 20 years. So that's a little bit about where I am. And I guess we can move into some of those threads as we go forward.
Yeah, thanks, Annalee. Emma, you are currently located in South Auckland, and that's where the majority of your curatorial and creative practice has been located for the past 18 years. I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about how your work as a curator has kind of moved from various art spaces over the past few years.
Yeah, thank you. I have been in this house, well, this house has been in our family for about 18 years, and I moved here when I was 19 years old to go to university. So I did my Bachelor of Visual Arts here in South Auckland, and I moved here as a young woman and embarking on sort of an art practice or turning my art practice into this sort of quantifiable qualification was this incredible process of kind of finding my feet here, understanding my positionality in the context of South Auckland, So as a migrant, as a Pacific Islander in Aotearoa, New Zealand, what does that mean? And so my art practice, which started as a sculptural practice or painting, which moved to sculpture, evolved into curatorial practice here. And it evolved in the process of sort of realizing or trying to find my community, really, here in South Auckland, finding the places that I felt safe and comfortable, and finding the other people who felt that way as well. So South Auckland has become so embedded in my curatorial practice because of that process of coming here to be an art student, and then doing a 4-year degree and planning to go home to Fiji to open a gallery. That was always the plan. And then seeing a job advertised, a full-time permanent role as a Pacific Arts Coordinator for our local council, so local government here. And I, it was, I couldn't not apply. Applied for it, really fortunate to have gotten the job. And in that role, I was able to really flex those curatorial ideas a bit more. Was able in that role to establish an exhibitions gallery in Otara, a very, very Polynesian suburb in South Auckland. And that's, that gallery, Fresh, Gallery Otara, fresh is a theme, was where I really, cut my teeth. I was very young going into that job, very ambitious, and set out to do an exhibition a month. And that was on the basis of, I just had so many, I just keep meeting artists who were like, I want to do a show. And I was like, well, we can do a show. It's not, the overheads are not excessive. And so we did that. And I think about it now and it's insanity, but we did 66 shows in 6.5 years, which is nuts. But I think what that did was it sort of, you get very, it becomes like clockwork. You know exactly what you need to put on a show, the basics of simply bringing people together. Promoing, hype girling is like my backbone. And I think that's what, I still do. And why I think I'm able to do this as an independent venture now is just, I shamelessly promote artists. I love it. And I do it on every platform in every way. But yes, Fresh Gallery Otara was a very important, critical step in my career. And I left the role when the local government, we got a very right-wing national government who decided to amalgamate the local government authorities in the Auckland region. So South Auckland, which is called Manukau City, Manukau is the name, the indigenous name of this whenua, this land, was subsumed into this big regional body, and we became Auckland, and we became referred to as Auckland South or South Auckland, which I had a problem with because it always felt like we were defined by our proximity to something that we were not. South Auckland is a term that now, I use a lot and I hashtag because we have a strong history of that name, not Manukau City, but South Auckland being attached to very negative media misrepresentations of the place and our communities here. So it's a very deliberate effort to kind of create a counter narrative to that. But South Auckland is where I've ended up staying. I'm so committed to this community because it's given me so much from those early years of sort of defining myself as an artist and as a young woman to getting my first opportunities in the arts, paid opportunities, and knowing that, these opportunities were unique to here. I wasn't probably going to have the same privileges going home to Fiji and trying to establish an art gallery there. And so I stayed and learned about things like funding and did lots of funding proposals. And after leaving Fresh, I practiced independently as a curator for about 6 years. 6 years C is a number that comes up a lot in my life. And then after having my daughter and leaving a relationship, I thought it was probably my time to go home to Fiji. So I went home to Fiji in 2018. Sorry, this is a long story. It's all part of the journey.
Yeah.
And then I ended up realizing when I was in Fiji that I needed to be here. So I reverse migrated, and then I reverse migrated, and I came back. And I thought if I was going to come back, I had to really do it. So yeah, last year I opened Vunilangi Vo as an independent art gallery in South Auckland, a commercial, a business, which relied a lot on arts funding, but also I'm really passionate about art, the trade, the ability for our communities to own art and feel that artwork is owning artwork and starting a collection and being proud of your collection is something that we can do as Māori and Pacific, as Indigenous people. It's not something that belongs to kind of an elite community in Central Auckland. It's for us, and I adore selling art to Māori and Pacific people, particularly in South Auckland, because I know that artwork is staying here and it's staying in our homes and it's circulating and impacting our communities. So yeah, South Auckland has become a very important ground, whenua, land for me to kind of plant my practice in.
Yeah, that there's so much to unpack there, and I want to actually rewind a little bit and talk to both of you about the actual the context of creating these art spaces that you have built. You know, what does that actually mean to young artists in the spaces that you work in? Annalee, I know that you work at Barbados Community College as a lecturer, and you've spoken a bit about, you know, seeing these really talented young people go through the, you know, the university, the art tertiary education, but at the end sort of having nowhere to take that. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the thinking behind Fresh Milk as a sort of an incubator for graduates to kind of move into.
Yeah, I mean, I was having a kind of an existential crisis about 10 years ago because the state was providing free tertiary level education to Barbadian students. So they would go through a 2-year associates and a 3-year bachelor's program. But then I noticed within a year of graduating, our attrition rate was almost 100% because there wasn't a kind of a structured environment for them to move into. There wasn't an established visual arts sector and certainly not an industry. So in 2010-11, we had a particularly strong group of students who were all fabulous. And so I set up Fresh Milk as an experiment to try and harness some of that talent and to see ourselves as a kind of a bridge between graduating from Barbados Community College and becoming more established. We are living in a space without a contemporary art museum or a national art gallery. There are a couple of small galleries that tend to exhibit, you know, more kind of stereotypical work for the tourist industry. But there isn't really, you know, established spaces or branded directors, curators, art writers, biennials, trade fairs, auction houses. That doesn't exist. So there's masses of talent, but the issue is if a lot of those students are coming from working class and lower middle class backgrounds, their families can't afford to support their careers. There's a small group of collectors. So what do we do? So Fresh Milk was set up in August of 2011. And it just kind of grew organically. We developed a residency program for local, regional, and international artists, of which you were one, which is where we met, and a number of public-facing projects. And then it just sort of grew to, you know, co-founding a residency in Aruba with colleagues there called Caribbean Linked, developing Tilting Axis. And it really was beginning to form, it has been forming a community of contemporary practitioners. We have a reading room of 3,500 books. That's probably one of the strongest reading rooms on the island, with a focus on the visual arts and Caribbean thinking. And it was just important to have a platform where, you know, I often think of artists here as an at-risk group, you know, or they're almost orphaned. Like, where do these contemporary thinkers go? And can we create a welcoming space that is inclusive for people that are sort of pushing the boundaries in terms of trying to create new works that force us to think about ourselves in new ways? So it really came out of a crisis around not wanting to lose young talent, and also, you know, revisiting my own experience as a young artist and feeling very isolated as a contemporary practitioner in a small island, and wanting to build more substantial bridges with my peers across the region. So Fresh Milk has become a vehicle for that. And like, you know, Emma has said, really has fed me in so many ways. It's been such a powerful platform for building community and building bridges and making people feel as though there's a sense of belonging. Yeah, so that's, yeah, it kind of came out of that sort of crisis in an educational environment here.
And I think one of the really amazing things about that residency program is the way that you host a local artist at the same time as an international artist, and so it just naturally creates this beautiful conversation, and both people, you know, benefit so much from that, you know, coming together in that space. It's truly incredible. Emma, I wonder if if you can talk a little bit about how contemporary art operates and is received in Pacific communities that you know, in Aotearoa, in your experience, and how it sits.
I can definitely relate to that isolation, Annalee. You know, I felt that so much at art school, and it was definitely, I think, the act of pulling an exhibition together, the act of creating a focus for a group of artists was a necessary function of our survival. And it came from the experience as art students of being encouraged to go to a lot of gallery openings and exhibitions in the wider Auckland region, and never really feeling like we were invited, you know, or that we were valued in those spaces. And so what we would often do is, you know, joke about, you know, it's where you go get free drinks. But I would always find that there was always a cluster of Māori and Pacific artists and gallery goers outside. So we'd be the ones outside in the shadows, feeling a lot more comfortable to have our conversations, to do our networking, and have really, you know, a good time, because, you know, the wine was flowing and we'd keep going inside to get the wine. But yeah, I think that's where it came from, this need to create our own spaces, because we knew that our communities were, our artists wanted to participate, but the opportunities were very limited. In terms of, you know, we've gone through this interesting change in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, for the last sort of 5-6 years, where, and I think globally to some extent, this sort of palpable thirst for diversity, you know, and this realization that a lot of institutions that have held power in the arts, particularly, are grossly Eurocentric. And one of our arts funding agency of the government here in New Zealand introduced a diversity policy in 2015, which encouraged those organizations who were getting publicly funded on an annual basis with millions of dollars to deliver to diversity. And so there's been this kind of shift that's happened, and we've gone through these processes of, you know, lots of opportunities coming up, but, you know, lots of tokenism as well. And where diversity is seen as something that happens in programming rather than, you know, a social inclusion approach where you would have diversity at every level of management. You'd have diversity on your board. Yeah, sort of tracking back to your question, it was, yeah, the need to create our own spaces really came out of the fact that the feeling that the mainstream arts community didn't feel very welcoming. And we wanted to create environments which were geographically accessible, because South Auckland is located maybe like 15 kilometers away from central Auckland. We wanted to create a space which was in our hood, you know, in the neighborhood. And in that way became a place that we could invite our communities to come and celebrate our work. And so shifting the geography of where you present and talk about art shifts everything. You know, South Auckland is a largely lower socioeconomic area. We have a high population of Māori and Pacific, of working class communities. And, you know, creating a gallery environment, creating an exhibition in an environment like this, it shifts everything. I'm dropping in and out of light. Yeah, so I think it was about sort of creating a parallel art world out here and changing the dynamics of everything about it. The audience who has access to it, who feels comfortable and centralized in those spaces, who shows, whose work is on the walls, who writes about that work, and who feels, yeah, that they can do things like bring all their children to an exhibition, or bring their parents, and we will have chairs for them and we'll make them a cup of tea, and look after them and not make them feel like they don't belong here. Because that's not a world which I want to invest in at all.
I think you've balanced that really well, though, with also sort of managing or negotiating that ability to, you know, exist and respond to the needs of the community, but also create a really safe space for critical discussions about the work that's presented in these spaces. And I'd like to talk to you both about this, because I know you've both been engaged and responsible for setting up things like the Pacific Arts Summit, as well as, you know, your involvement in publications like South and other critical writing that you do. And equally, Annalee, with Tilting Axis, the Catapult series, and other publications that you've worked on in the Caribbean. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the importance of you know, creating that critical dialogue around the practices and the benefit that that has for the arts ecology that you work in, and for the artists, you know, who are working in those spaces.
I mean, I think I feel there's a lot of synergy with what Emma's talking about, because I think that the work around Fresh Milk Caribbean Link Tilting Axis is, you know, I live in a region that was colonized by a number of European nations, and all of the decisions were made externally about everything, right? So for centuries, and, you know, we're just a young independent nation. Barbados became independent in 1966. So there was a kind of a slew of countries that were becoming independent in the 60s and 70s. And I'm very conscious about Tilting Axis as a platform that is trying to think about how to shape a healthy cultural ecosystem in the Caribbean, but on Caribbean terms, not in response to anywhere else, forming our own alliances within the Global South, building our own networks where people feel welcomed and understood. And for Caribbean Linked, which is this very beautiful residency program that takes place in Aruba with Atelier 89, that I co-founded with Elvis Lopez, who's based there, an artist, and Holly Bino. And that's a lovely project because we work specifically across linguistic divisions. So colonially, we've been divided on our linguistic divisions. So the French, Spanish, Dutch, and English Caribbean tends to function within their linguistic kind of milieu. And we insist on bringing in young artists from all of these linguistic territories who come in very much with a national identity. Many have not been to another Caribbean country. Many have not been to a country where people speak a different language. And after 3.5 weeks of living and working together, they have formed a very powerful bond. And they feel now that they're connected to this larger regional network. And it is such an incredible thing to watch unfold. And for the last number of residencies we've had, we've maybe brought in, I don't know, over 50 or 60 people over the number of editions. Those groups stay together and organically other things start to happen. But there's this connection to the Caribbean that is formed through living and eating and making work together and mounting an exhibition and getting to learn a different space. And for me, this is very important because there's a kind of a, you know, the Caribbean is a place that has a very fractured and traumatic history. And these projects, Fresh Milk, Tilting Access, Caribbean Linked, are trying to move against that history and to behave in ways that are different to how we were taught. So rather than questioning whether or not we're legitimate or we belong, we're trying to create spaces where people belong and feel connected. And for those who are in the diaspora, you know, the Caribbean is really arguably one of the first globalized places in the world. So we exist outside of the archipelago. The Caribbean is in Amsterdam, and it's in New York, and it's in London, and it's in Toronto. So when people from that diaspora who feel marginal to those global north's mainstream cities, and they come into the Caribbean or into these platforms, they can kind of inhale and exhale and feel as though they also belong. So I feel that this work is very much about saying the Western canon and the global north are not the only spaces that are legitimate. We have stories to tell, we have artists, we have many voices, and we feel very connected in spirit to the many artist-led initiatives that exist across the Caribbean, many that existed before Fresh Milk, that are trying to create these platforms for engagement.
I've often wondered why we don't have something similar in the Pacific. Emma, I mean, you went back to live in Suva to, you know, with the plan to, you know, open an art space there before you opened Wunalungi Vo. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what, you know, what that process was like and how it actually felt different when you actually kind of got there.
Yeah, I wish we had that connectivity. You know, in the Pacific, we're such a smaller, I mean, we have so many similarities with the Caribbean as small island nations. But our ocean covers 1/3 of the world. Even the geography, even the logistics of moving between islands is expensive. It's a real barrier. And when I started to think about a gallery in Fiji, it was definitely this thing of we need the strength of our region, you know, the strength of our diaspora as well, and we need that to come back to these sites in the Pacific. It just, the infrastructure doesn't exist so much. We have countries who do have tourism as their main GDP, and so, as you mentioned, you know, the collecting or the arts ecologies in a lot of these places is that it privileges tourism, it privileges really the white gaze and this sort of paradise perception and this idea of the Pacific from an outsider perspective. And so it's harder for artists to challenge those dominant aesthetics because they don't have a market to sell those things. Right. And they don't have a lot of international curators coming to look in and say, you know, what you're making is important and we need to show it around the world. And so when survival is on the basis of selling, it becomes, very difficult to sort of foster a community of people who are not making, tourism arts. So there was a lot of work to do. When I went home to the Pacific, to Fiji, I realized that the gallery that I wanted to open, which was a fun space to do exhibitions and have a, foster a community of local artists who were making important critical work, was going to be overshadowed by the survival of having to run a place like that, and the fact that there, we don't have any funding. We have very little funding. I did plan a gallery in Suva with my sister Maria Carling, who works in the youth development space, and so there was a lot of stuff that we could have done to sort of logistically prop up an exhibitions gallery concept, but as a startup business, those things start to become core, really, and that's where the money comes from. If you're going to run a public space, it's like, oh, you have to do coffee, you have to do these things, which all become things which absorb your time and energy. And as mothers, it was like, well, this is a very limited resource. And so where was I going to be spending all my time and money? And it was probably, well, time, because there was no money, cleaning a coffee machine and writing proposals to the UN. And that's not, I had the privilege of thinking, man, in New Zealand, things are different. There's arts funding, there's a culture which I had invested in for a decade before going home to Fiji, where, it's easier. And I say it through gritted teeth a little bit, because I came back to New Zealand because it's easier. But I came back with a real commitment to the Pacific, and a commitment to looking at things like fresh milk, which when Torika did the residency, I was just, every photo, every story she shared was just like, this is what I would love to see, I think a residency programs have shaped a lot of my practice as well. My art school here in South Auckland brought in three international artists who worked in with social practices. And so they came to South Auckland, they looked at the socio-political context of our art school, and they made projects about that. And that was really dynamic at the time, because at the time, we didn't really have a culture in South Auckland of critical arts dialogue or anything like that. And for these three, an artist from Chile, Juan Castillo, Alwin Remillo from the Philippines, and Amy Plant from the UK, for them to come here to little old Otara in South Auckland and say, there's really important things to be said about this space. Those international perspectives helped change our perspective. And so, I think bringing in artists is really important. One of my big achievements last year was getting funding to bring in two artists from the Pacific who were supposed to come to Vunilangvo this year, but obviously COVID postponed that. So this is where my commitment to the region is really in practice now, is bringing Pacific artists from the region to come to South Auckland, to see the privileges we have here, to experience this arts ecology that we've sort of grown out here in South Auckland, and be introduced to the New Zealand ecology, arts ecology, but to do it in a way through a Pacific gallery that is committed and open to the Pacific. And to also, like you were saying with Fresh Milk, the benefit of bringing those artists from the Pacific to our local artists here in our arts community here is so exciting to me. We definitely need, in South Auckland and Aotearoa, we definitely need fresh perspectives on what it is to live in the Moana Oceania, in the Pacific region, because, a lot of perspectives of the Pacific in Aotearoa are framed by the diaspora communities here, which predominantly are from Samoa, and countries like Fiji and the whole of Melanesia, very minimal in the perspective of the Pacific from a New Zealand position. So bringing in the Pacific into South Auckland is, a big part of my service to the wider region. And it's doing it by using the privileges of this country on the Pacific Rim, rather than doing it at home in Fiji, where I would love to be. But also I found, and I still find, I find our politics in Fiji, where we have a very dictatorial and military government, I didn't realize how much, but it really affected me emotionally. And I found that those acts of oppressive, dictatorial governance, I was surprised, because in New Zealand, in a relatively well-functioning democracy, you just sort of think, oh, these things just happen. But in Fiji, in a small island nation, I found, and I'm wearing military fatigues, which is terrible, but I found our politics in Fiji very, you would get used to it, but I would want to speak out a lot more than I felt safe to do in Fiji.
That makes me think of the post that you made, Annalee, on Facebook in June in response to the George Floyd murder, and your statement on your sense of identity growing up in the Caribbean and in Barbados, and also how that's impacted on how you raise your children. And it was really interesting to look at that work that has grown out of, I think, a previous project, but the Lere We Talk, and the sort of the courage that it takes to spark these difficult conversations that I think you both do in your respective places. I wonder, Annalee, if you could talk a little bit about that project, because it's an ongoing work.
Yeah, thank you. So I started maybe, I can't remember now, maybe 6 or 8 years ago. I did something called White Creole Conversations. So I'm read as white in Barbados. Most people here have some mixed race ancestry, because that's how the colonial project worked. Through a lot of trauma, that's basically how it worked. But I was raised as a white Barbadian on a sugarcane plantation, and like everywhere else, race is also constructed because of sort of social indicators. And although I do have mixed race ancestry, I grew up in a time of binaries when you were either considered white or black. And I have always been interested in notions of race, and my children are like a white Anglo-Creole mother, and their father is Indo-Irish, Jamaican, Trinidadian, Hindu Catholic. So their very bodies are, are just this very complicated mix of what it really means to be a Caribbean person. And there's not a lot of conversation about race outside of people's kind of social bubbles. And the Black Lives Matter movement and the George Floyd moment shifted things, not just in the US, but everywhere. And so I kind of noticed that people were seemingly more willing to have conversations about race. And I decided then that I would sort of, just kind of put something out there to begin to talk about whiteness in my own sort of experience, which really was very much about being raised in a white social enclave. And I went to a white primary school. When I went to secondary school at the age of 11, that's when the first time I experienced being a minority. Barbados is a strange place. It has this sort of social apartheid, this voluntary social apartheid, where I could go to an event of 300 white people or an event of 300 Black people. And even though there's a lot of professional and educational mixing, we still haven't integrated more fully. And I I was trying to express in that post that our lives are poorer because of that, and how difficult it is for me to be expected to live in a group of 8 or 10,000 white people, that I'm supposed to be fed intellectually, romantically, culturally in this small milieu. And I made a very conscious decision when I had my children that, you know, I wanted them to have a different kind of exposure. I wanted to have conversations about race. I wanted them to be able to articulate what it meant to be, you know, kind of their very bodies incorporating all of these different backgrounds. So I then launched La We Talk, Real Conversations on Race and Class in Barbados, and about 40 people signed up. We were in a theater run by a Black Barbadian woman who was also interested in the discussion. And, you know, people came in, it was COVID, so they would find their name on a chair and then they would sit, and a stranger of a different race or, you know, would come up, and they were presented with a suite of questions. And they had these intimate conversations about race and class. And, you know, I had a young white Barbadian woman who expressed that she saw herself as being very progressive. And it was when she spoke with this young Black woman, she felt that she was saying things in a way that made her not want to be the person that she heard herself expressing. And she acknowledged that she had only had conversations about race within a small white Barbadian community. And I think these echo chambers are really problematic. And I think that this kind of the history that we embody continues to have these kind of remains in the way that we interact with each other. So my sense was that people welcomed the opportunity to have this conversation in a safe environment. And we're hoping that we're going to be able to have a few more. But yeah, it's a very strange, thing. In some ways, I feel that white Barbados doesn't talk enough about race, doesn't reflect enough on what it means to be white. I would say Black Barbados or Black Barbadians often see white Barbadians as a homogenous group, and the diversity within that group is not understood clearly, or it's not articulated. So we're just really at the very, very beginning. And I think that there needs to be a lot more conversations around what it means to be, you know, how race is constructed in this country and how we express it. And sometimes we're not even conscious of it, which I think is problematic. But it was an attempt at beginning to facilitate intimate conversations between people of different races and classes.
Yeah, I think that model for that dialogue is really amazing. And Emma, I was listening to your interview of the Nuku podcast, and you talked about how the art world is not immune to systemic racism. And I was wondering if you could kind of reflect on that from a perspective of Aotearoa, and if there's that kind of level of introspection from colonial settler communities in relation to tangata whenua, but also to the Moana Oceania mix that makes up, especially Aotearoa, where you're based.
I had a moment when Annalee was speaking where my heart just wanted to cry, because this is what always happens. That moment that young woman had, where
she saw herself differently. Yeah.
I mean, these are the moments that we facilitate in the arts, you know, because we have internalized so much colonial trauma and racism in white bodies and in brown bodies and every brown on the spectrum and Black bodies. And it's so harmful. But these moments where, and I spoke about it a bit in that podcast, where you wake up a part of your conscience that has been muted through the colonial project is so powerful. And we can do it in creative spaces because people are open to being a bit vulnerable, because there's no right and wrong with art. We all come to this space knowing that you read something with your own worldview, and everyone's worldview will define this art in a different way. And so I find creating forums for dialogue, what we use this term Talanoa in the Pacific, the exchange of ideas, the process of finding resolution through dialogue, is so powerful when it's hosted in a way which is safe, when it's hosted in a way that acknowledges the white privilege, which often changes the dynamic and rhythm of that conversation big time. And so, yeah, I love hearing about that event, those intimate conversations, because I think with Vuni Langivo now, we've really moved in that direction where intimate conversations, where small gatherings, which are not about mass numbers, not about the funding we used to get was all about accessibility and participation of as many people as possible. Now it's more about making those encounters really special and powerful. And I think we have even more impact when it's done well on a smaller scale than trying to do it for everyone all the time. And yeah, I think, this is what I love about curating and managing a gallery, is being able to foster that conversation between art and audience, and to show artists who are helping us as a community of shared experience move forward and develop and wake up those parts of our conscience that have been,
dormant.
Dormant. Yeah. I've forgotten your question, Torika. A little cry.
I think you did respond at the beginning.
I wanted to add something there, because there's something about the colonial project and how empire has tried to ruin intimacy, right? There were there were laws against people loving across borders of race. There was something in Barbados at one time called the Poor Relief Fund. And if you were a poor white person, you could get funds from the church, but that Poor Relief Fund had a moral code. So if you were a white woman and you had a relationship with a Black man or a mixed race child, you were struck from the Poor Relief Fund. And, there's also this kind of cognitive dissonance that I think the Caribbean is full of, because it was very typical for white men from the plantation to have relationships with Black women in the village. So there was this very unequal power dynamic. There were many children that were born out of that liaison. And very often the women, of course, would raise the children, and the men on the plantation may have given money, but they didn't, there wasn't an emotional connection there for the child. So there's this residue of this insistence that we were not to care about each other. And this is the way in which I think empire ruined intimacy and fostered madness, because we did love across boundaries and we paid the price for it. And I think what is important about these conversations and the work that, is happening in these various platforms is that we realize our own power to make different decisions, different to what we were taught. And so creating these intimate platforms means that we can choose to live a different life and to create programs that are not just about numbers and ticking the box and having this massive reach, but that we need to have conversations with ourselves, and we need to have different choices and realize that as active citizens, we can shape that platform that absolutely rejects the trauma of that such destructive colonial project that we have had to live with for over 3 centuries. And we are barely trying to undo that as a very small, young, independent nation. So yeah, I just wanted to make that link between empire and intimacy and madness and active citizenry.
Absolutely. I mean, it speaks to me of the way you've both broken down these binaries of public and private spaces, and it's a very radical thing to actually bring audiences into your personal spaces and to hold that space for these conversations. And I'd love you to both reflect on actually what that means to have these spaces located where there is no separation or very little separation between your personal life and what that also means for you as parents, what that has sort of enabled you in terms of your own practices. Emma, do you want to give us a bit of background? The last 6 months has been huge in terms of moving Bunungangivo from a commercial premise to your home space. So maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah. Having set up the gallery last year in a commercial premises in Otahuhu, a suburb up the road, it's a pretty it's pretty hood, that suburb, so the overheads were pretty cheap. The rent was pretty cheap. However, it was still rent. When our country went into lockdown in March, I started to see those dollars going into someone else's pocket for nothing, because my gallery had to be closed for 6 weeks. And I did have, a lot of landlords in that first lockdown were great and gave us very much, rent relief and that kind of thing. But, as a new business, I just couldn't stomach all that money going down the toilet. So I had the opportunity, having only opened in May of last year, to end our lease after 1 year. And so I was in lockdown, enforced national lockdown from March until April. And I was at home with my 6-year-old daughter at my home where I am now, and I would spend time outside because my child narrates every thought in her mind. And speaking of madness, I mean, I thought I was going to go insane, and so I'd say, "Mummy's going outside." So I'd go outside and I look at this garage and just think, this garage, I've been in this house for 18 years, and in all the time I've lived here, this garage has been the home of artist studios. It's where photo shoots for the queer collective FAFSWAG have been made, many photo shoots. We've done so much tattooing in here. We've organized protests and activism in here, had so many parties and just like gatherings of artists and creatives and all sorts. So the garage was kind of like just sitting here looking at me going, and I sort of thought, a gallery is a simple space. It's a concept of, good light, walls are good, and this garage is sitting in a mature garden surrounded by trees. And it was being at home with my daughter during lockdown, where I spent a lot of time in the garden, really recalibrating my mental health with nature and getting reconnected and grounded again. And I think that's what this global pause forced a lot of us to do, is just realized that the way that I was working was so disconnected from the things which are actually good for me. And so being in a garden is the most beautiful thing. I love being surrounded by birds and hearing the trees and seeing the sky. The premises in Otahu was in an arcade, which is one of the reasons it was very cheap and reminded me a lot of Fiji. The thing with being in an arcade is it's great in the winter, you're protected from all the elements, but in the summertime, you don't even know what's happening in the sky. You know, you are so physically dislocated from your natural setting. And this is like the polar opposite to that. My garage is located literally 6 footsteps from my house, where I live with my daughter. I've written a little bit about this whole shape-shifting that happened. And I was in Hong Kong last year and I was doing this talk at the Parasite conference, which was fantastic. But I remember someone talking about how decolonization has become a kind of tired trope in arts discourse. And I was so offended because I thought to myself, you know, decolonization is not a trend. It's not a curatorial concern. For me, my decolonization practice starts from home. It starts from how I look at myself in the mirror. It starts at how I name my child. It starts with what we eat, how we dress, how we are in our home. And so for me, the center of decolonization is this house. It's my home. And so to bring my professional world of curating and creating environments to talk about art so close to that nexus was very powerful, because I can't be anything but that in this new space. I have to completely walk the talk in this space. And I love it because there's no pretense. There's no, you know, this is a family, you know, we are on Indigenous land, on Tangata Whenua's land in South Auckland, Maori land, which has been settled. But this little piece of land that I live on has now got 20 years of my family history embedded in it as well. And so, yes, it's been a whole process of kind of decolonizing in all these different ways to bring the gallery back to the land. We've reoriented the opening of the gallery away from the house and towards the water, which we've got at the back, which is an estuary, which has incredible history from the first settlers, the Maori Indigenous people who were here, and the way that this land was encountered. This waterway behind us was part of that journey, and which is in the names of these of the land around us. So it's completely reorienting, recalibrating the whole purpose of doing this work. And of course, yeah, bringing it home means anything that happens here has to be my role as a mother, my daughter's safety, her world. This gallery has been built around that. And so I love that too, because I feel like running a business last year in a commercial premises meant that at the end of the day, it was about money. It was about the need to pay rent, the need to be open during business hours, because that's what my Google page says. And at the end of the day, my daughter had to fit into that. I was running ragged, trying to pick her up from school, trying to bring her back to the gallery so I could open until 5 p.m. For her to be having to sit there while I, you know, talk to all kinds of people, mostly eating hot chips from the bakery next door. You know, my role as a mother was sidelined so I could do that. And bringing it home means stripping away all of that capitalist kind of sinew of this job of creating exhibitions and running a gallery. And it feels so good.
Emma, thank you. Annalee, your the platform that is Fresh Milk, the physical space, was, I believe, maybe your yoga studio and your art studio before it became the
Yeah.
Colleen Lewis Reading Room.
Right. Yeah. So I built it in 2005, and it was initially my studio, and then I developed a kind of a commercial line of painted furniture for children mostly, and that fell by the wayside when the economic crash of 2008 happened, and then I turned it over to Fresh Milk for the last 9 years, stupidly. So I've marginalized myself from my own studio. So I'd be packing up like a teenager in between residencies, moving out and moving back in. And then I would have the riot act read to me by my children when strangers would walk through the kitchen, and my son is like, "I'm in my boxers, Mom. Can you just get this under control?" So, I was trying to balance all of these things. So I probably have about 12 steps to my between my kitchen door and Fresh Milk. I think I'm super privileged in that I don't own this land. This is family land. So I've had the privilege of building it on this space. And when people come, because it's in a rural space, they really inhale and exhale. So there's something really wonderful about that. And I think they love the intimacy of the home. Fresh Milk is about not only a dairy farm, but it's about women turning their blood into milk to nurture their young. And so this is really about a nurturing space. It feels like a nurturing space. It is a beautiful space. We're under a grove of mahogany trees. But it is also a form of plantation. So there are some people that enter this site and they, the hair stands up on the back of their neck. And I'm a white Barbadian who is doing this work on a sugar plantation. So I try to be very honest about that. The entire island was a plantation at one point, everything, by the third quarter of the 17th century, it was basically one plantation. So it's really been trying to think about how to think about the possibility of transformation. Can we transform a site by changing the activity that happens on that site? Is it possible by having inclusive programming and having a reading room where you value critical thinking and robust conversation? Can that be part of the healing that transforms us and our capacity to have richer lives because we can engage with each other across race and class and nationality? I'm feeling now like, maybe Fresh Milk, we're going into our 10th year. At the moment, we're doing an amazing program called Catapult, which is all virtual, but Fresh Milk was invited by Kingston Creative to be part of a COVID relief arts grant funded by Open Society Foundation. And those 6 programs are working with 1,000 artists in over 20 Caribbean countries. We're only managing 2 of the 6 programs, but we're managing 24 regional stay-home residencies and 32 lockdown virtual salons. And it's made me think about the possibility of doing more off-site programming so that I can now also spend more time in the studio myself. So it's interesting to see how these platforms ebb and flow. Different to you, Emma, we don't have really a lot of access to grant funding. So a lot of this has been volunteer work. And I think those things, they can only sustain themselves for a period of time. It's not really a sustainable model. But I do love having it on, where I live. I feel, I do really enjoy being able to live and work in the space in an organic way.
Both of you would normally be traveling like crazy in a normal year. But I know, Annalee, for you, it's actually been incredibly busy. I mean, with the programs you just talked about, but your own practice, and you've had multiple exhibitions in the UK and Edinburgh. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about those those current exhibitions and those recent works.
Yes, thank you. So my first UK solo exhibition was at a place in the north of England called Harlem Art Space, which was lovely because it's in the seat of the Industrial Revolution, but it's also a gallery that works with artists that engage with the rural. And so I've been doing a lot of drawings on plantation ledger pages over the last 6 or 7 years. I found hundreds of plantation ledger pages in a abandoned bookkeeper's office in the place where I grew up. And I was interested in using that as a substrate because it suggests complete order. These very ordered rows and columns that archive data and speak about the plantation in singular economic terms, when really sitting below the soil is a virtual slaughterhouse, and the entire colonial project is really a lot of chaos. There's been a lot of residual chaos, and even becoming an independent space, colonial powers basically abandoned these regions that brought them so much wealth and modernity. So I've been intervening images of wild plants, wild botanicals that grow in former sugarcane fields, as an example, to talk about trying to see how the soil is healing itself. These wild plants feel like a quiet revolution happening in the fields. They're an alternative to the monocrop. The sugar industry is dying, and they're kind of reasserting themselves. And in collecting them and drying them and pressing them and drawing them, I started to learn about their value as an apothecary that was used by the enslaved who lived on the land. So it became a medicine cabinet. And the enslaved were given small plots of land where they would have to grow their food. But those plots were also sites of tradition and of memory and of oral kind of histories and medicine cabinets. And they sat, as Sylvia Winter says, as a pre-capitalist site within the larger context of the capitalist plantation colonial project. So I showed these wild plant drawings in Worksworth, and I also showed a suite called F is for Frances, who was the name of a woman that lived and worked here. I found her name in an 1815 will. She was written about by Thomas Applewhite, who owned Walker's at the time, and he referred to her as his favorite girl slave, whom he was offering manumission from slavery 6 years after his death. And I was really struck when I read this one night late in the studio, and she lived and worked here in this place, and there was no surname. I couldn't track her, but I wanted to show that she existed, and so mapped her name out using the shards that I find in the soil when I walk the fields, which are ceramic remains that came in on the ballast of ships from England as cheap crockery sets, and they sit everywhere I walk every day. They are coming up in the soil from hundreds of years ago. And more recently doing drawings of parasites. The Cuban essayist Antonio Benitez Rojo speaks about Caribbean history like a long annelid parasite that's moved through the bowels of the region, which is an incredible metaphor for the extractive economy. So I'm looking at parasites in terms of relationships, extractive economies, trying to create family portraits of people that weren't allowed to stay together because they were loving across boundaries. What does that parasitic history, how does that impact our blood, the way that we engage with one another? So that body of work is currently at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh. And then there's a whole series of parasite drawings that will be shown at the Kunsthal Vienna in Austria next year, and working towards the Casablanca Biennial in Morocco also in 2021. So that's a little bit, yeah.
Incredible. Thanks, Annalee. That's a great segue, actually. Emma, you were an exhibiting artist and part of the curatorium for, what year was it? It's all a bit of a blur now, 2018? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about that project? And then maybe also the opening exhibition that you have, your first exhibition at this current site, would be lovely to hear about.
Yeah. I was invited in 2018 to be part of the curatorium for the Casablanca Biennale, and it was a wonderful opportunity because much of our art world in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the sort of colonized South Pacific looks to Europe and as the kind of cradle of fine art excellence, and conveniently completely overlook the non-white world. And so to have an opportunity given to me to curate an exhibition for a biennale on the African continent felt like a magical, wonderful opportunity to kind of build on all the things that we've been doing here, which is to sort of look at the non-white world and its magic and intrigue and importance. So for the exhibition, I definitely wanted to showcase, as the only people from the Pacific region represented in the Biennale, a really great representation of the Pacific region, which is a huge region, but also accessing funding from New Zealand, had to have a strong connection to this place. So I brought together a group of artists who, with consultation from Leilani Kake, who's an artist I collaborate with a lot, who all had a common feature, which was that they are mothers and parents. And the year before that, I had done a residency in Christchurch in the south of New Zealand with my daughter when she was 3. And it was the second residency I'd done as a mother, but that one was so hard because I had no one. I did it by myself, and
it was long. It was 3 months, wasn't it?
It was 3 months. It was incredibly difficult. My daughter didn't want to be there. She didn't want to go to a different early childhood education center. She didn't want to have all new environments, and she wanted the things that she wanted. So it was hugely challenging as a mother. It was challenging professionally because so many parts of a residency are about taking all the spontaneous opportunities which are presented to you when you meet new people. And there's no spontaneity when you're trying to create stability for a 3-year-old child as a solo parent. And so it was such a limiting experience, but so, I'm so grateful for going through it. I remember crying at nighttime because I was like, well, this is so hard. This is one of the most wonderful opportunities I've had, but it's so hard. And I wanted, after that experience, to privilege mother artists because it's hard to do this. And we don't put anything before our children, that role that you have has to come first. But of course, if you've had a professional career before having a child, for me, it's been a difficult learning to accept that I can't go at the same pace and rhythm that I used to go in, and I can't neglect my role as a mother. And so there is a whole new pace and rhythm to being a mother who is also a creative professional. And so what I wanted to privilege with this exhibition in Casablanca was women who are doing that and navigating that terrain, and also to work with the challenges of that, because when I did that residency in Christchurch, there was no accommodation for the fact that as a mother artist, you have to do things differently. Things cost more. Half of that fee went to childcare, and that was only just so I could get through 5 hours a day without the constant demands of being a mother. And so when we decided to do this project, Leilani and I decided to commit to working with mother artists. It was to commit to everything that comes with that. And so working on the schedule of trying to get mothers away from their homes to do planning. We had to do a retreat because we had to take them out of the city. So they had a reason to be focused and to be separated from their everyday lives. So we did 2 retreats before which was, two gatherings was all we could afford to do before we actually got on a plane and took 5 mothers to Casablanca. I remember,
and who else? How many others?
oh yeah, so this is the thing, we don't travel alone. The first artist who asked me if a child could come, I was like, this was the whole point. It was so we could separate from our roles, but of course, you know, you can't say no. So our artists, our group of 5 artists became 5 artists, 3 teenagers, a husband and a cousin. And so it was 11 by the time we got to Casablanca. We had to, you know, of course it costs more. It costs more for mothers to travel, but we accommodate for those things because for Leilani Kake in particular, who asked me if her son, who was 15 at the time, could come with us. Leilani had a stroke the year before. She felt that she couldn't, in her heart, travel to the other side of the world. And if anything had happened to her, she couldn't be there if she couldn't have a child with her. And so, of course, you accommodate for that, and she finds the money, and we add that to the, you know, logistics of the event. So you have to make mothers, you have to accommodate for mothers' needs, and so that's what we did. When we got there, you know, traveling with 5 mothers is kind of amazing. You know, there's no shortage of pills, medicine, wipes, sanitizer, and this was before COVID. Everything was, we just had everything covered. And the logistics, or the logistical thinking of 5 mothers, you know, the power combined was quite amazing. So yes, when we got there, Casablanca was quite challenging in terms of delivering a show within a program which was sort of expanding to a scale that it hadn't expanded to before. But with this group of superwomen, we managed to deliver a beautiful exhibition. Christina Ene, who invited me to develop the project for the Biennale, gave us a beautiful venue, and she knew that the venue would be perfect for us. It was octagonal. It was an octagon, so it wasn't even a square space. It was round and beautiful, had a huge dome, and it was also in the middle of a park in Casablanca. So it was all this work that I've done in all my career around social inclusion and trying to create ways for non-traditional audiences to engage in the arts. Christine knew that by giving me a venue like that meant that the space was hugely accessible in a park that everyday people would go and just hang out in, and a lot of you know, homeless people slept around there. It's where vendors who would come around selling hot coffee would come, and full of cats and all kinds of it was just that real hearty urban grassroots grittiness that I love. And so yeah, and of course when you travel with mothers, the first thing we did was we cleaned it. So it was bleached on day 1, and then we delivered an exhibition called A Maternal Lens, and it was devised as well because understanding that we were going to be navigating so many cultural and linguistic divides between, you know, bringing these nuanced ideas of identity and belonging in the Pacific to the African continent. We had to be able to connect on a level that is human, and of course maternal ism is something we all have a relationship with, you know. And it was a beautiful exhibition for women artists, and particularly mother artists at the Biennale, to come and feel fully fucking affirmed. And it just felt so good to say, you know, yeah, we pulled out all the stops to bring 5 women from the other side of the world, and some of their children and the husbands and the cousins, to be present, to know that it's important that we are here and included in this program. And so, yeah, it was sort of a wild sort of platform for activism and a beautiful show. And then Casablanca was, you know, challenging in that very, very like the Pacific, very like Fiji, in that, you know, they said to us, you can't send stuff because it might not arrive. You probably have to bring the show on you. And I was like, yeah, I've done that before. You know? So we literally turned up with our show. And so a lot of the beauty of that was that for the artists who worked in installation, which was all of the artists, their work then responded to the site, and the site became part of their work. And so it was a really lovely way to just embed this work from the other side of the world, using in some cases like materials from our ocean here, into Casablanca, into the architecture of that space. And it felt like a lovely, site-specific kind of important gesture of inclusion. And I have so much respect for Christina Ene and the Biennale for hosting us, because there's no frame of reference for the Pacific in in so many African contexts. To talk to people about saying the island that I'm from, the country that I'm from, has kind of like less than 1 million people. Even the geography, the humanity of the Pacific is such a vastly different concept to so many places in Africa. When I was in Kinshasa last year, it's a mega city, talking about Fiji in the context of a city of 17 million people. It's like, how do you even connect that? It's amazing, but Africa, it's the cliche that it changes you, but it did just like completely recalibrated my whole art world, and even though, Morocco on the top edge, but its proximity to Europe is so interesting as well. And its own shifts and changes in terms of the Muslim influence and their practices of indigenous tattooing was such an amazing way to connect as well, and how much it's stigmatized there. When I brought this group of Pacific Island women, and we're all tattooed, 2 of us have facial tattoos, and the rest of us are covered on all of our limbs. And we took a tattooist with us. And it was so groundbreaking, because the women that we talked to, they talked about Berber women, indigenous women there. You don't get opportunities. You won't get a rental accommodation if you're tattooed. You don't get jobs if you're tattooed. And so we rock up there covered, and we're also like twice the size of your average Moroccan woman. We were quite a sight. And currently,
tell us a bit about the show that we can see behind you, well, parts of.
So this is another kind of maternal thing, which was lovely. The artist Vea Mafileo, who I invited to produce our first show here in the news site, she produced her first documentary film last year, and it was a film about her bicultural Tongan, Pākehā European settler family and existence, and the challenges of parental separation, of dislocation, of diaspora. This film followed her family. It's incredibly intimate perspective, which has so many parallels across Pacific communities around and diaspora communities all over the world. She really wanted for this film to be delivered to Tongan communities, and so she made a plan, a team made a plan to deliver this film to Tongan communities in the United States, and they were in the middle of a 32-day tour in the States when COVID happened. And so after delivering 2 dates on the tour, she returned from from the States to 2 weeks in quarantine, and then returned from that high energy film promotion headspace to being at home with her 3 children, who are 3, 7, and 12. And, for people who are parenting through the pandemic, parenting through lockdown, and for people who are managing like this collapsed creative economy, this year has been so challenging for everyone, but so challenging for mother artists and for creatives who've watched their worlds fall apart, you know, but have to be strong to parent at the same time. And so when we started talking, and I talked about, you know, shape-shifting the gallery to this environment, we both, and a lot of us creatives, we needed a focus. You know, the future was so unknown. We didn't know when we could travel again. We don't know what, you know, the beginning of this year was like such a stark reality that we just don't know what's happening in the world. The world's on fire, you know. So I think this exhibition, inviting Vea to produce an exhibition for a gallery rather than the sort of the film work which she's evolved to, her practice into, was kind of like a lifeline from one mother to another for us to have focus, you know, to get to focus on something to get us through these small windows of opportunity to do our personal pursuits whilst parenting in a pandemic. And I only have one child, she had 3 children. It was a lot. So she developed an exhibition. We had this opportunity through our arts funding body to apply for what was called arts continuity grants to keep practicing even though everything had fallen apart. I had gotten a grant to write a book about Funilangi Vo's first year of operation, and she got a grant to digitize her archives. So 17 years of video archives from her practice. So we made an exhibition which was which ended up being site specific to the space, because when I moved into this house, Vea and I were both at art school together, and you know, pre-children, and we did a lot of partying in this garage. So her sister is a photographer, and she actually made a lot of photographs in our garden here. So we decided to do a complete throwback show to look at the art history of this site. And Vea made a new video work and has shown 2 other video works from her archives. And her sister Annalee has made this incredible installation of her photography from that period, so from 2002 to 2005. And Emily, at the time, her elder sister was the mother of her son, who was about 5 when we were all at art school at the same time. And her son features heavily in the photographs. Vea talks about her film production company as a family production company. So all her children are involved in all her work all the time. And her children and Emily's son are all in this work and have all grown up in this work. And so, you know, we see time in our children, and we see a lot of these photographs, and I'm in some of the photographs too, you know, these are the pre-baby bodies. And so we see time in our bodies and the reflection of ourselves and our families. And so that's what this exhibition, which I adore, is like a beautiful way to open the space, to kind of be about this space, be about grassroots, homegrown practices. Yeah, it just feels like a lovely show to open our garage gallery.
Yeah. So, last thoughts. What's next? What are you looking forward to out of the end of this hellish year that we've all experienced? And what do you think what more transoceanic conversations do you think can emerge?
Well, there's certainly, I mean, in terms of closing out this year, we're going to be closing out Catapult, you know, later in December. And that feels like a very good project to end on. For me, I think that, you know, these things all have like ebb and flows. And so there are different periods of time in our lives where some things have greater focus than others. And for the last 9 years, fresh milk has been a pretty major focus, which has been amazing. Caribbean Link Tilting Access. It was a couple of years of the British Council. And it was interesting to hear Emma talk about, you know, body shifting and the mapping, because I'm sort of now in the post-reproductive phase of my life. My children are older. My daughter is almost 19. My son is 26. They're coming home soon. We haven't been together, the three of us, for over 2 years. So I'm really excited to see them soon. But I've been making work about, called The Second Spring, about the post-reproductive phase of women's lives, which unfortunately we've inherited a very kind of reductive patriarchal narrative around that as a limiting and negative experience, when in fact it can be the most empowering phase of our lives, where there's greater confidence and greater clarity. And I think, you know, we need to look at post-reproductive whales and the way in which they are revered within their communities as holders of knowledge, and the ones who raise the youth, and they know where the salmon is. So I'm interested in what's coming. I'm interested in moving more deep into my practice. And what this year has made me think about, which I haven't been able to do, but I keep thinking about, slow cultural work and degrowth. These are the two phrases, the two words that I've been focusing on. And I think this is what the world needs to think about. Not bigger and better and more, but slower degrowth. The world can't afford to keep growing exponentially in terms of population or businesses or extractive economies. So for me, I really want to think about, you know, before making a mark or putting something out, you know, to really think about it, and to try and maybe pull back a little bit from the activism, and to maybe spend some more time moving more deeply into my own practice, and thinking about these ideas of slow cultural work and degrowth.
Amazing. Thanks, Annalee. Emma.
Annalee, when you mentioned that concept the other day of slow cultural work, so much clicked for me. And I knew there was words around this process I've been going through of bringing my work more in line with my life, and knowing that the gallery now has to function on a different rhythm. And because this is family owned property, I'm not thinking about leases. Our time space continuum has shifted, and I'm so much more comfortable believing that good things take time, slowing it down. I love that as a concept. It's something I feel, with this gallery now, where we don't have, we're not eligible for a lot of funding. I just crowdfunded to fund a year of programming, which is about 10,000 New Zealand dollars to support 7 exhibitions over the next year, or probably 6, the magic number. But yeah, slow cultural work is kind of the words that I've wanted to find. And I'm so grateful that you mentioned those 3 words, because I think that's the pace I want to work at. And I think also feeling, from building, this is the second time I've built a gallery from scratch after last year. This one was a big one because this was a full refurbishment, working with the soil, not just someone else's building, but everything about this gallery. And I know from an artist I was working with at the beginning of this process, how much this gallery has to tell me what it needs. And this is a process of just being in it, of spending time with it, testing things out. And I think I'm excited to know what Vunilangi Vol will evolve to, because I'm learning every day what it needs, and how people feel in the space. So I'm excited to sort of just facilitate that over the next who knows how long.
Thank you both so much for this incredible conversation. I'm just so grateful that you were both able to join me, and I feel like it's a long overdue conversation between you two, and I hope that you could meet in real life sometime and there's some future collaborations out of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having us, Torika. It's so great to be able to feel, even in this removed space, that we can be intimate in these conversations across almost the similar latitude in some ways, right?
Yes.
So thank you so much for making this happen.
Yes, I just want to say thank you, Torika, as well. I think, things that Fresh Milk has done, things that Community Reading Room has done, have influenced me in such a big way. And so to see these amazing women, to have this conversation has been really enriching. I'm grateful. Thank you very much.